Yesterday's prophecies, today's headlines. This is the Hal Lindsey Report. And now, Hal Lindsey.
Good evening and welcome to this edition of the Hal Lindsey Report. The founder of Pakistan's nuclear weapons program has revealed that North Korea paid kickbacks to Pakistan in exchange for critical weapons technology. Abdul Qadir Khan shared his high-tech secrets and equipment with a host of rogue regimes, including Libya and Iran. In 2004, Khan confessed to operating an illegal international nuclear technology smuggling ring. The next day, Pakistan President Pervez Musharraf granted him a full pardon, then placed him under house arrest. He called Khan a one-man show. In written statements to Simon Henderson, a former journalist who now works for the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, Khan detailed bribes paid by North Korea to various Pakistani military officers in return for classified missile components and plans. To support his claims, he produced a letter written in English, purportedly written by a high-ranking North Korean official, later published by the Washington Post. The $3 million have already been paid to Army Chief General J. Karamat, and $500,000 and 3 diamond and ruby sets have been given to General Zulfikar Khan. The letter contradicts Pakistan's official position that Dr. Khan operated without the knowledge of the Pakistani officials, including military officers, when he sold the country's nuclear technology abroad. American intelligence officials have never accepted that story. They maintain that it was inconceivable that Dr. Khan could have had regular access to Pakistani military planes for his deliveries, or that he would have been able to conduct high-stakes diplomacy with other nations without the knowledge of the country's military leaders. U.S. officials believe the letter is authentic but cannot guarantee its veracity. They say, however, that logic dictates that Khan could not have sold a wide variety of Pakistani military secrets to other countries without some involvement by the Pakistani military establishment. This revelation comes at a particularly bad time for Pakistan. It is already under fire for giving safe haven to Osama bin Laden. On Sunday, White House Chief of Staff William Daley told ABC's This Week that the United States has decided to suspend $800 million in military aid earmarked for Pakistan. No one knows how the announcement will affect the already strained love-hate relationship between the U.S. and Pakistan. The Pakistanis have between 60 and 100 nuclear weapons that the West does not want to fall into the hands of al-Qaeda or other Islamic groups that are very strong in Pakistan. Our presence there also serves as a restraining influence in the tense conflict between Pakistan and India, both nuclear powers. We continue to need Pakistan's cooperation in allowing our supply lines to pass through to a landlocked Afghanistan. Yet the Pakistan's government, military, and intelligence services have repeatedly proven themselves to be unreliable, even adversarial. All of which paints a perfect picture of how confusing and treacherous it is to be a player in the Middle East in these last days. And folks, that's just exactly the kind of conditions the Bible prophets painted for the times just before the coming Christ. Among the suspected AQ Khan clients is Bashar al-Assad of Syria. In 2007, the Israeli Air Force launched a bombing raid against a secret nuclear site near Aleppo, Syria. In May of this year, the director of the International Atomic Energy Agency confirmed for the first time that the target was a nuclear reactor under construction. The IAEA also confirmed that the site was linked to 3 other suspected Syrian nuclear sites, although the agency refused to reveal their locations or functions. Assad's government has been under assault as part of the so-called Arab Spring uprising. Reports indicate that at least 1,400 civilian opposition members have been killed by Assad's security forces. The Syrian government's desperate response has been to redirect anger toward Israel and America. A few weeks ago, Syrian TV encouraged viewers to storm Syria's border with Israel in efforts to provoke an Israeli reaction. Israel Today reported that Assad's regime paid poor farmers $1,000 each to cross into Israeli territory or harass Israeli border guards. Nearly 24 Syrians were killed, mostly in the minefields that stretch along that border. On Monday, Syrian TV encouraged groups loyal to Assad to assault the U.S. Embassy in Damascus. The embassy was briefly breached, as was the French embassy. The State Department formally condemned the Syrian government for inciting the attack and is demanding compensation. But none of Assad's usual tricks seemed to be working. Instead of turning on Israel, the Syrian opposition blamed Assad. The U.S. Embassy attack was handled without bloodshed, so that trick didn't work either. Assad is now trying to defuse the uprising by offering reforms, but the protesters aren't buying into the effort either. Middle East dictators seldom live to enjoy a quiet retirement, so Bashar al-Assad is growing increasingly desperate for some sort of distraction that will allow him to remain in power. Now, at this point, it's important to remember that Syria is the only country that fought Israel in 1967 that still maintains a formal state of war with the Jewish state. It may be Assad's last whole card. The prophet Isaiah referred to the burden of Damascus, a city that ranks as one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world. Isaiah's burden, which means a heavy prophecy, is about Damascus' sudden and total destruction in the last days. He wrote, "Behold, Damascus will cease from being a city, and it will be a ruinous heap. The fortress also will cease from Ephraim, and the kingdom from Damascus." You know, the best Hebrew text, the Masoretic text, translates this, "Damascus shall be forsaken forever." And the reliable Hebrew Targums adds, "Its cities shall be forsaken and desolate." This refers to all the cities of Syria. As I have written before about this critical prophecy, Damascus has been conquered and occupied many times over its 6,000 years of existence, but it's never been destroyed. Again, referring to Damascus, final judgment, Isaiah predicted that it will take place overnight during a time of international upheaval. The nations will rush like the rushing of many waters, but God will rebuke them and they will flee far away and be chased like the chaff of the mountains before the wind, like a rolling thing before the whirlwind. Then behold, at eventide, trouble, and before morning, it, meaning Damascus, is no more. This is the portion of those who plunder us and the lot of those who rob us. In the light of the instantaneous destructive power of nuclear missiles, the modern day mechanics of this prophecy are now easy to understand. Israel has already warned Syria that if it attempts to use any weapons of mass destruction against the Jewish nation, Israel will strike back with its own WMDs, and the Israelis have hinted that it will be nuclear. Assad is under such pressure to stay in power that he might just be foolish enough to launch a diversionary attack against Israel with WMDs in the hope of rallying other Muslim nations to his side. Goaded on by Iran, the pressure is building for just such an attack. Any miscalculation on Assad's part, and he's not proven himself to be perceptive thus far, could quickly and easily escalate into a massive retaliation by Israel that would fulfill Isaiah's prediction of catastrophe. Each week on the Hal Lindsey Report, I try to show you how today's events are bringing to life the predictions of the ancient prophets. Like a watchman on the wall, I'm warning you that time is short. Christ will soon return for his church, and I want you to be ready to go. And I want you to see how urgent it is that you make certain your family, your friends, and those around you are ready to go too. Please help me continue this work and help me take the necessary steps to broadcast the Hal Lindsey Report into more homes in America. I need your help now more than ever before.
To support this program, send your tax-deductible gift to Hal Lindsey Media Ministries, P.O. Box 470-470, Tulsa, Oklahoma 74147. You can also support this ministry online. Visit hallindsey.com or call 1-888-RAPTURE.
On Sunday, May 22nd, a monster tornado nearly a mile wide tore through the heart of Joplin, Missouri. It ripped the roof off a hospital and destroyed thousands of homes and businesses. The storm killed at least 117 people in the small city in southwestern Missouri. U.S. weather officials said the tornado that hit the city of 50,000 at dinner time on Sunday was the deadliest single tornado in the country since 1950. At least 400 were injured, many with massive internal injuries. Survivors told harrowing stories of riding out the winds of almost 200 miles per hour in walk-in coolers and in restaurants and convenience stores. They sought refuge in bathtubs and closets or ran for their lives as the tornado bore down upon them. Rescue efforts were hampered by downed power lines and broken gas lines that ignited fires. Cell phones communications were spotty because 17 phone towers were toppled. Roaring along a path almost 6 miles long and nearly a mile wide, the tornado flattened whole neighborhoods, splintered trees, flipped cars and trucks upside down and into each other. Some 2,000 homes and many other businesses, schools, and other buildings were destroyed. Americans are beginning to take stock of the massive natural disasters, all hitting us at the same time. This monster tornado comes close on the heels of the massive tornadoes that rampaged across Alabama and the South just a few weeks ago. At the same time, millions of acres along the Mississippi River are submerged beneath the raging floodwaters. Droughts in other areas have resulted in massive wildfires. As Americans watch all of these things unfold on TV, we're gripped with the fact the weather has gone wild. Whether or not each series of disasters are record-setting is not as important as the fact that they are all happening at the same time, and we are aware of them as they happen. In many cases, we sit before our TV screens and watch the disasters as they are happening. Now, all of this compounds the mounting anxiety we feel all around us. When this is coupled with the pervading sense of further impending economic disasters, the unrest sweeping the world, and the increased threat of terrorism as the conflict between the West and Islam intensifies, it's easy to believe one of Jesus' major predicted signs that would herald his soon return. Jesus predicted that there would be increasing global disasters that would cause men's hearts to fail them for fear of what is coming upon the world. In America particularly, it's hard to miss that God is bringing warning judgments upon our increasing wickedness. And speaking of men's hearts failing them for fear, according to Family Radio Network founder Harold Camping, the world was supposed to end last Saturday, May 21st. Very few recognized Bible prophecy scholars bothered to address Camping's false teaching. We just assumed that his thesis was so evidently false that no one would take it seriously. But I was personally surprised when the liberal media began to give Camping's pronouncements so much attention. Most secular media care nothing about what the Bible says on any subject. Then I realized that the media saw an opportunity to discredit the Bible and Christians. In their God-rejecting arrogance, they wanted to paint all Christians as simple-minded morons, especially because we chose to look expectantly toward the return of Jesus Christ to replace this troubled, violent world with the kingdom of God. They saw an opportunity to discredit and ridicule Christians in general and Bible prophecy in particular. This is why I posted a disclaimer on my website on May 18th. I stated what the Bible literally said, and that is that no one could know the exact day or hour of Christ's return. Also, noted that camping did not represent true Bible prophecy teachers. His theology and reasoning was so far outside of the mainstream Bible teaching as to lose any resemblance to Bible prophecy as it is outlined in the Scriptures. I was particularly disappointed with FoxNews.com for allowing Dr. Manny Alvarez to publish an untrue allegation calling me a date setter without providing any evidence. It's true that I've always emphasized that Christ could come at any moment, and that at the rate the prophetic signs are being fulfilled, he could have come before the year 2000. But I did not say Christ absolutely would come by any of these certain dates. It's fascinating to me that even the very liberal news site, democraticunderground.com, described more accurately what I teach. Here's what one writer said. Let's face it, guys like Hal Lindsey, the Left Behind works, and related whatnot capture the imagination, motivation, and beliefs of a huge chunk of what was termed mainstream evangelicals. That much is undeniable. Now, they don't set dates, but they put a lot of effort in signs indicating that the apocalypse is historically imminent. Now, that is a fair statement. Amazing. Jesus was asked by his disciples to tell them the signs of his coming and of the end of the age. This incident is recorded in Matthew chapter 24, Mark chapter 13, and Luke chapter 21. That's how important it is. He gave many signs that would all appear together in the same time period, and like birth pains in a woman, increase in frequency and intensity. When he finished, the Lord taught them a parable to apply how we should view these signs. Now learn the parable from the fig tree, he said. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So you too, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near, right at the door. Truly, truly, I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. In this very important parable, Jesus applies the significance of the prophecies he had just spoken. Everyone knew that when the fig tree puts forth its first leaves, the general time of summer was near. There was no specific date assigned to this phenomenon, but everyone recognized that the general time of summer had arrived. Just so, Jesus then applied this to what he had predicted about the signs of his return and the end of the age. When the signs all appear in the same time period and begin to multiply like birth pains, he commands us to recognize that the general time of their fulfillment was near. Now note, he commands all Christians to recognize this. Jesus then warned that no one could know the day or the hour. However, he commanded us to recognize when the general time of the signs' fulfillment had arrived. Jesus said that this generation would not pass away until all things take place. In other words, the generation that saw the signs begin to be fulfilled would not die or pass away until all the things predicted about his coming and the end of the age were fulfilled. We are that generation. This is the first time in history that all the prophetic signs have appeared in one time period, and all began to increase in frequency and severity. And the key signs were the rebirth of the state of Israel and the recapture of Jerusalem. Now all the other signs are increasing in magnitude and frequency in concert with each other. The Lord is at the door, ready to return, folks. I don't know the day or the hour, but I do know what I'm commanded to know, that it must be soon. We're in the general time. The most important thing that those of us who expect his any moment coming can do is to live a life that is pleasing to him. I'll be back in a moment. Here on the Hal Lindsey Report, I try to inform you about the raging battles for the soul and future of these United States. The ferocity of the attacks against your heritage and our liberties as Christians and Americans is almost unbelievable. But you won't hear about this in the mainstream media. That's why I need your help to spread the word each week. Keep the Hal Lindsey Report on the air by sending your tax-deductible gifts to Hal Lindsey Media Ministries, P.O. Box 470470, Tulsa, Oklahoma, 74147. You can also support the program by visiting my website, hallindsey.com, or simply phone toll-free 1-888-RAPTURE. If asked, most people would name the stock market crash of 1929 as the starting point for the Great Depression. Historically, that'd only be half right. The stock market did crash in October of 1929, but in reality, the overall decline in stock prices on Black Tuesday was just 2.5%. The shock to the economy reverberated until the market finally bottomed out in 1933, 4 years later. By then, it had lost 89% of its original value. The current Federal Reserve Chairman, Ben Bernanke, is widely recognized as an expert on the Great Depression. In 2002, he famously apologized on behalf of the Federal Reserve for causing the Great Depression through its failed policies. Then, as chairman of the Fed during the biggest financial collapse since the crash of '29, he set about the task of causing history to repeat itself. Most Americans mistakenly believe the Federal Reserve is a financial regulatory agency of the United States federal government. It is not. It's a privately owned banking cartel created by and for the benefit of the member banks. It's like any other cartel. Let's say OPEC. OPEC, or the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, is not interested in keeping America supplied with cheap, plentiful oil. OPEC's job is to make certain that the price stays high and the supplies don't exceed demand. In other words, it serves to benefit its member countries. And the United States is not one of them, but Iran is. The Federal Reserve's job is to ensure the banking system stays healthy and profitable for its members. When the market crashed in 2007, Ben Bernanke organized the infamous TARP bailout. TARP stands for Troubled Asset Relief Program. Ironic, isn't it? The assets weren't troubled. The ones who were troubled were the banks who owned the overvalued assets. And they were troubled because it looked like they might lose some of their profits. Notice who got bailed out first. The Federal Reserve banks. To pay for TARP, Bernanke authorized the printing of an extra $1 trillion in cash. He then dumped it into the system by giving it to the banks. The $1 trillion didn't exist until it was printed. It wasn't backed by anything. It was only legal because it was authorized by the Federal Reserve. But it had no more value than if counterfeiters in somebody's basement had cranked it out. for which they would have been thrown in prison. A Federal Reserve note is backed by the full faith and credit of the United States, but little else. Its value lies in its use as the world's reserve currency. When a dollar is fake, it dilutes the value of real dollars by the number of fake dollars that are out there. In other words, what happened is our dollars all got devalued. Soon after taking office in 1933, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt ordered all privately held gold to be confiscated to satisfy the nation's creditors. After the outbreak of World War II, America became the armory to the world. We sold billions and billions of dollars worth of weapons to the Allies. We required payment in gold. By the war's end, the majority of the world's gold reserves were back in the United States. In the mid-1940s, the policymakers of the victorious Allied powers set out to create a new economic order for the post-war years. Meeting at a hotel in Brettonwood, New Hampshire, they created a system of exchange rates where the currencies were pegged against the dollar and the dollar was convertible to gold. Two international banking institutions were also created: the International Monetary Fund, also known as IMF, and the World Bank. In the 1960s, the Federal Reserve increased the supply of American dollars to pay for President Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty and the war in Vietnam. The inflation caused by dramatically increasing the money supply caused investors to worry, and well, they should have. By the time the 1970s arrived, foreign governments had begun redeeming their dollars for gold, lots of gold. On August 15, 1971, the Nixon administration severed the link between the dollar and gold, defaulting on its payments and sending the dollar into crisis. The so-called floating currency scheme, hatched 25 years earlier at Bretton Woods, quickly began to fall apart. An informal Bretton Woods-type agreement became necessary. In 1973, the Nixon administration cut a deal with the Saudis and through the Saudis with OPEC to accept only U.S. dollars in payment for oil. The world had to buy oil, and since it could only buy them with U.S. dollars, the world's nations were forced to continue to hold U.S. dollars in reserve. That was a spark of genius, and that arrangement continues until now. Today, the Bretton Woods institutions continue to function through the United Nations. But as for the dollar continues to weaken, many nations have begun to call for a new international standard, a new world order, if you will, one in which the United States is not calling the shots. Nations like China have begun divesting themselves of their excess U.S. holdings. For example, since last October, China has quietly dumped 97% of its short-term U.S. Treasury bills. Altogether, China holds about $2 trillion in American debt and says it plans to dump about 2/3 of it. Last year, a European think tank warned that the world will see even greater economic upheavals starting in the second half of this year. The group, known by its acronym LEAP, which stands for Le Laboratoire Européen d'Anticipation Politique, with my sincere apologies to the French-speaking world, or in English, the European Laboratory of Political Anticipation, assesses the international system as having entered into a state of complete decay. LEAP forecasts that by mid-2011, any hope for a significant and lasting global economic recovery has evaporated. Summer 2011 will confirm that the U.S. Federal Reserve has lost its bet. The U.S. economy has, in fact, never left the very Great Depression in which it entered in 2008 despite the trillions of dollars injected, as the vast majority of Americans are perfectly aware of. The report continues. Unable to launch a QE3, the Fed will watch helplessly as the interest rates rise, U.S. deficit costs explode, the world dives into an intensified economic recession. QE3 refers to a third round of so-called quantitative easing. That's just another way of saying that the United States is printing unbacked currency again and using it to buy its own debt. The bulk of the T-bills purchased since late 2010 have been purchased by the Federal Reserve. Though you'll probably hear rosy mainstream media predictions about it, the actual probability of a QE3 began to fade when the Fed buyers at the Treasury window looked around and saw they were the only ones in line. Remember, the U.S. dollar is backed only by faith in the fidelity and trustworthiness of the United States. And we're not fooling anybody anymore. The Leap Bulletin goes on to forecast the collapse of stock exchanges as the dollar loses 30% of its value on the foreign exchange market. As recently as April, economists at Deutsche Bank rated the U.S. economy as being just slightly above that of Greece, Ireland, and Portugal. Both Moody's and Standard & Poor's credit rating agencies say America's AAA rating is at serious risk. This should give you a hint of how serious our debt problem is. Gold is hovering around and just above right now $1,500 per ounce. Officially, the United States claims to have just under 9,000 tons of gold in reserve. 9,000 tons are 18 million pounds at $1,500 per ounce, amounts to less than $500 billion. That's not a drop in the bucket in Mr. Obama's giveaway program. The U.S. deficit for 2012 alone is projected to be $1.65 trillion. That's just how much we're overspending, not how much we owe. The U.S. debt is almost $15 trillion. The world GDP is a figure used to express how much money all the money in the world adds up to each year. All the money in the world amounts to a little over $58 trillion. Now, put another way, the United States has borrowed a quarter of all the money that exists in the world, and we can't pay it back. When I return, we'll talk about what happens next.
When you support the Hal Lindsey Report with your tax-deductible gift, you're joining me as a watchman on the wall. I've told you many times that I believe God raised up the Hal Lindsey Report to be a voice of warning to the church, the nation, and the world. I've also told you that I can't do this job alone. I need your help. I need your prayer support and your financial support. And praise God, I've received both in generous supply in the past. But we can't stop now. Please stand beside me on the wall as we proclaim the good news of Jesus Christ and warn the world that He's coming soon.
To support this program, send your tax-deductible gift to Hal Lindsey Media Ministries, P.O. Box 470-470, Tulsa, Oklahoma 74147. You can also support this ministry online. Visit hallindsey.com or call 1-888-RAPTURE.
What would an economic collapse of the United States look like? We can't look to the Depression era for answers. We're living in a different world today. A collapse would probably set off a chain reaction of events from business failures to mass unemployment to looting, rioting, and violent crime. We saw what happened in the New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. Imagine what would happen if the nation's fuel supply were suddenly disrupted. In 30 days or less, every American city would be out of food and clean water. It would become a nightmare scenario of looting and rampant crime. How likely is that of actually happening? Consider the situation as it stands now. China's stake in the U.S. debt is huge. It is officially the United States' biggest creditor. Right now, America relies on the fact that if China were to cash in its chips, the resulting chaos would bounce back and hit the Chinese just as hard. But if the Chinese suspect that the dollar was going to crash anyway, then all bets are off. The Europeans are in no position to begin purchasing excess U.S. debt. They have plenty of their own problem economies to worry about. The earthquakes and tsunamis have crippled our traditional lender of last resort, Japan. Americans are already beginning to see and feel real inflation. Inflation much higher than the official government numbers indicate. It isn't just fuel prices, although high gas prices are raising the cost of everything from artichokes to xylophones. Food inflation is so bad in some parts of the world that we are seeing massive food riots. Meanwhile, in America, we continue to turn food grains into ethanol fuel. We export our clean burning natural gas, of which we have more than anyone else in the world, and import dirty burning foreign oil. The U.S. housing industry is in free fall. When prices began to drop, buyers decided to wait until real estate prices bottomed out. The problem is, they won't bottom out until people start to buy. The real estate market is flooded, resulting in record low new home construction. Investors have started dumping municipal bonds in record numbers. State and local government debt is at an all-time record high as a percentage of the U.S. GDP. The former mayor of Los Angeles, Richard Riordan, recently predicted that 90% of U.S. cities and states could go bankrupt over the next 5 years. Then there are the multiple threats of war. Even as we're seeking ways to extricate ourselves from Iraq and Afghanistan, we've become embroiled in a conflict with Libya. Last year, the two Koreas came as close to open war as they have in 5 decades. The Middle East is ripe for explosion. U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton recently admitted that the Obama administration vastly miscalculated the so-called Arab Spring.
We're, disturbed by the reports of efforts to crack down on journalists and bloggers and judges and others, which we don't think is in keeping with the direction that the Egyptian people were heading when they started out in Tahrir Square.
Egypt seems certain to become an Islamic republic led by the Muslim Brotherhood. In Syria, Bashar al-Assad is butchering his own people at an alarming rate, while the Obama administration studiously looks the other way. On June 3rd, Assad was polishing the speech he intended to deliver to the parliament, declaring victory over the protesters. In nearby Turkey, the opposition leaders were meeting to strike a deal with the Muslim Brotherhood. Once the Brotherhood came aboard, hundreds of thousands of their loyalists hit the streets in Hama, and the revolution was back on. Assad's forces fired into the crowds, and the Associated Press reported that dozens were killed. Later, armed militants attacked government security forces, and reports suggest that more than 100 policemen and soldiers were killed. Unbelievably, it now appears that President Assad will attempt to deflect the tension from the revolt by sending Syrian civilians to attack Israel's border with Syria, which they did over the weekend. Some reports say as many as 23 were killed. Of course, the Syrian and Arab media covered the incident at the Israeli border, but no media were allowed into the areas where the Syrian government is brutally crushing the opposition protests. This perfectly illustrates how much of a tinderbox the Middle East remains. Back here at home, most Americans have no idea how horrific the coming crash will be. What we do know is that there is no way the current status quo is sustainable. At some point, system failure is a certainty. So where does this put us on the Bible's timeline? According to the book of Revelation, this will be the order of events. The text speaks of the first 4 seals being broken. This begins the first series of escalating judgments in the 7-year tribulation, which are the focus of the book of Revelation. These seals release the dreaded 4 horsemen to ride upon the earth. With the breaking of the first seal comes the rider on the white horse, symbolizing the ascension of the Antichrist to a position of global power. It's significant to note when the first seal judgment is open, the rider on the white horse carries a bow but no arrows. He conquers in a bloodless, perhaps political conquest. He's not a warlord. He's a religious politician with a solution for the world's collapsed economy. The second seal is then broken, releasing the rider on the red horse. This rider is given power to take peace from the earth. It says, there was given him a great sword, symbolic of what today might be called weapons of mass destruction. The third seal releases the rider on the black horse. After war begins, economic collapse and famine follow. He symbolizes worldwide economic depression. References to a measure of wheat or 3 measures of barley for a denarius are symbolic of a day's food for a day's pay, whereas oil and wine are symbolic of great wealth. In the Bible's Great Depression, the poor will suffer catastrophic poverty, but the rich appear to weather the storm in relative comfort. It almost sounds like what we're seeing today. Almost. We've been almost there since the dawn of the 21st century. It has felt like at any moment the trumpet might sound. We're so close that many argue we're already somewhere between the breaking of the first and the third seals. However, let me say this, we cannot be there yet. The tribulation period is but 7 years long. It begins with the unveiling of the Antichrist, which is depicted by the first seal. If the seals were opening, the Antichrist would already be here, and the church, because of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, would be gone in the rapture. Israel would have to have already signed a covenant with the Antichrist, which guarantees her security. The covenant officially starts God's 7-year time clock, counting down to Christ's second coming. Clearly, Israel has yet to achieve any measure of the Antichrist's peace and security, no matter how false it will be. But we do see the world steadily growing ready for the rider on the white horse to rescue the world from a global economic catastrophe. We're on the brink of global war, but we've been on the brink of global war since September 11, 2001. The globally economic situation is unsustainable. We've spent all the money in the world several times over, and we're trying to find a way to spend it one more time. But a global economic catastrophe has been inevitable since the collapse of the Bretton Woods system in 1973. It began to crumble in earnest after the dot-com bubble burst at the close of the 20th century and passed the point of no return 7 years later. But it hasn't collapsed just yet. However, the key to the Bretton Woods economic system, the good old USA, has now spent itself into an unsustainable debt. And the looming U.S. economic collapse will cause a domino effect on the entire world's economy. And so with this, all 4 horses of the apocalypse are saddled and ready to burst forth. But as yet, none of the riders have saddled themselves up. But they could have at almost any point since the turn of the century. But still, the Holy Spirit continues his mission as the restrainer. He is all that is keeping the world from total collapse and keeps holding back the floodgates of unbridled evil. I believe it is his gracious restraint that is keeping the dollar afloat, the economy chugging, Al-Qaeda at bay, Iran in its box, America from collapsing, and Europe from eclipsing the U.S. as the premier global power. All this he is doing to give the final offer of grace before the coming judgment of the world. All the necessary conditions for the tribulation are in place. In the past, everyone assumed that if various nations or even the world got into dire financial straits, the United States would bail them out. After all, we were the richest, strongest nation in the history of the world. But today, as evidenced by LEAP's Global Europe Anticipation Bulletin, America is now considered the sick man of the world. And what's more, we're the sick man who won't go to the doctor. Unfortunately, a perception of serious weakness or inconsistency in America's economy can cause the rest of the world to go into uncontrolled panic. And I think that is only a matter of time. You know, some people who write to our website are palpably stressed and shaken by what they hear on this program. Others are excited that what they hear means Christ's coming must be very near. I am concerned and report these unpleasant stories because my mission as a watchman on the wall is to show you and the world that what the Bible predicted will happen is happening. That means that the other things the Bible forewarned, like the rapture, will happen too. You know, I dearly love my country, and I don't want to see her fall. But I know from prophecy that it's inevitable. However, any delay in that collapse allows time for more people to accept Christ's pardon. Your readiness to meet Christ may be indicated by your reaction to the prospect of his soon return. If you're stressed and nervous and dread it, then you should take that as a warning that you need to spiritually prepare for that day and do it now.
Folks, we've just completed a major overhaul of our website, hallindsey.com, in order to bring you more convenient news and perspective than ever before. Here, let me show you what I mean. You'll find continuously updated news feeds that cover a wide range of top domestic and international stories. You can also watch current and previous editions of the Hal Lindsey Report on demand, 24 hours a day. It's ready when you are. Plus, there's the latest and most exciting edition, my new video blog. Each week, I'll share scriptural teaching and insight on late-breaking events from around the world as they relate to the prophetic scenario. Perspective you can find only on this website. You just might want to make it your new home page. You'll also find convenient ways to support the broadcast and order my books, DVDs, and audio teachings through our safe and secure online store. Sign up for our email list, and I'll send previews of each week's program right to your inbox. You can also send us your comments, suggestions, and prayer requests. Keep them PG, please. Stay informed and help us share the message of the gospel with others around the world at thenewhallindsey.com.
If you're a regular viewer of the program, you've heard me discuss the 4 distinct spheres of world power the Old Testament prophets predicted for the last days. We're seeing them develop so rapidly that I felt we needed to review the role they'll play in the end time scenario. The prophet Daniel foretold the rise of the Roman Empire, its fall from political power, and its ultimate revival in the last days. Daniel chapter 2, verses 41 through 43, said it would share some of the strength of the 4th kingdom, Rome, but in a weakened form, like iron mixed with clay. In that you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron. It will be a divided kingdom, but it will have in it the toughness of iron, inasmuch as you saw the iron mixed with common clay. As the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of pottery, so some of the kingdom will be strong, and part of it will be brittle. And in that you saw the iron mixed with common clay, they will combine with one another in the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, even as iron does not combine with pottery. Now allow yourself to ponder this incredible prophecy in the light of today's events. In fact, if you watch and listen to the daily news, you'll see various parts of these prophetic themes repeatedly. Daniel's description of the final form of the Roman Empire came as part of a 5-part prediction that outlined the future history of Israel. The Jews were conquered by 4 successive world empires, exactly as Daniel predicted. First Babylon, and Media-Persia, Alexander's Greek Empire, and finally the Roman Empire. There remains an unfulfilled final week of years during which Israel will be subordinated to the reincarnate Roman Empire led by the Antichrist. For 2,000 years after Rome's fall, the nations of Europe fought an endless series of wars aimed at reviving the old European Empire of Rome. For those same 2,000 years, there was no Israel to experience Daniel's 70th week, which was absolutely necessary. In 1948, Israel declared its rebirth on its ancient homeland. That same year, Europe began to come together in a grand economic alliance, forging a new pan-European empire by peaceful means for the first time since the fall of Rome. The first sphere of global influence in the last days, the revived Roman Empire, is, as Daniel prophesied, partly strong and partly weak. What divides it are the competing self-interest of the member states in a democratic alliance. And if you read the newspaper, you know that the tremendous wealth and strength of some members of the European Union is compromised by the enormous weakness and financial distress of other members. So the entity we know as the Eurozone is strong on paper, but weak and vulnerable in reality, like iron and clay. Now, the second sphere of global power was predicted in detail by the prophet Ezekiel, would you believe, 2,650 years ago? Like Daniel, his prophecy required the existence of a nation called Israel at the same point in history as his prophesied alliance. Ezekiel predicted a partnership between this power and Persia, or modern Iran, together with many others that would launch an invasion against the reborn state of Israel. Echoing Daniel's prophecy, Ezekiel wrote, "And you will come from your place out of the uttermost parts of the north, and you shall come up against my people Israel like a cloud to cover the land. In the latter days I shall bring you against my land." Now, some people unfamiliar with this prophecy may ask, how do you identify Russia as the one described in this prophecy as Gog? There are 3 clear clues. The first clue is the time factor. This event happens in the last days, shortly after the Jews have been brought from their predicted worldwide dispersion and made a nation again. Ezekiel prophesied about the power from the north this way: "After many days you will be summoned. In the latter years you will come into the land that is restored from the sword, whose inhabitants have been gathered from many nations to the mountains of Israel, which had been a continual waste. But its people were brought out from the nations and are living securely, all of them." The second clue is the geographical home from which this power comes. It comes from the uttermost or extreme north. That's the meaning of the Hebrew word used here. It's the uttermost or extreme north from Israel. Whenever directions are given in prophecy, they assume Israel as the center point, unless noted otherwise. Now, there's only one nation to the uttermost or extreme north of Israel: Russia. The third clue is ethnic. Ezekiel predicts the tribal forefathers that merged together and became known as the modern ethnic Russian people. Son of man, set your face toward Gog of the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh, Meshach, and Tubal, and prophesy against him. These names are mentioned in an ancient history as living to the north of the Caucasus Mountains. Herodotus, a noted Greek philosopher of the 5th century BC, wrote of Meshach and Tubal. He identified them in his time as the Samaritans and the Muscovites who lived in the northern Asian Minor. Do you note the sound Muscovite? Probably Moscow came from that word. Josephus, an important Jewish historian of the late 1st century AD, wrote of a people of his day known as the Muscovy and the Thobalites, who were founded by Meshach and Tubal, respectively. He also said that the people called Magog were now called the Scythians by the Greeks. It's the Scythians who are known as the primary ethnic origin of the Russian people after the 5th century. The amazing prophecy should convince the staunchest critic that only God could inspire such accuracy of events some 2,650 years before they happened. The idea of a new Russia became popular in the 1990s after the disintegration of the Soviet Union. There were visions of a new, vibrant Russian partnership. The Bible envisions no such peaceful East-West partnership. Russia's role in the last days is that of a hostile invader who ultimately marches at the head of a Persian Islamist alliance against Israel. Ezekiel predicts this will happen at a time when Israel will be a land of unwalled villages. This apparently refers to a false security that will result from a predicted covenant that guarantees their security. The problem is that the one who guarantees it is the Antichrist of Rome. Ezekiel prophesies that the Russians will be drawn into this conflict as if it had hooks in its jaws. In the last few years, not only has Russia built Iran's nuclear reactors, but it has supplied weaponry to protect them. It has also become Iran's prime protector in the United Nations Security Council. An Israeli attack against Iran's nuclear facilities would whip up Islamic sentiments to a fever pitch. And Russia, having billions of dollars at stake, and no doubt many casualties among the Russian nationals working at the nuclear sites, would be under considerable domestic pressure to retaliate against Israel. The word picture painted by Ezekiel of a reluctant Russian bear goaded into an Iranian Islamic invasion of Israel is stunning, especially given the time frame. He says it will be in the last days when Israel is once again a nation in its historic homeland.
Each week on the Hal Lindsey Report, I try to show you how today's events are bringing to life the predictions of the ancient prophets. Like a watchman on the wall, I'm warning you that time is short. Christ will soon return for his church, and I want you to be ready to go. And I want you to see how urgent it is that you make certain your family, your friends, and those around you are ready to go too. Please help me continue this work and help me take the necessary steps to broadcast the Hal Lindsey Report into more homes in America. I need your help now more than ever before.
You can support this ministry online at hallindsey.com or by calling 1-888-RAPTURE, hallindsey.com, or 1-888-RAPTURE.
The book of Revelation introduces the third sphere of global power that will be a major player in the last days, the kings of the East. Little is mentioned in the Bible about this Asian world power until the climactic events of the tribulation that lead to Armageddon. What is strange about the introduction to this power is that God releases 4 powerful fallen angels that are so violent they have been bound at the river Euphrates for centuries. Revelation chapter 9, verses 13 through 18 predicts who these four angels will stir into action and what they will be led to do. Listen. I heard a voice saying to the sixth angel who had the trumpet, "Release the four angels who are bound at the great river Euphrates." And the four angels who had been prepared for the hour and day and month and year were released so that they would kill a third of mankind. The number of the armies of the horsemen were 200 million. I heard the number of them. And this is how I saw in the vision the horses and those who sat on them. The riders had breastplates the color of fire and of hyacinth and of brimstone. And the heads of the horses are like the heads of lions, and out of their mouth proceeds fire and smoke and brimstone. A third of mankind was killed by these three plagues, by the fire and the smoke and the brimstone which proceeded out of their mouth. This is a description of something far in the future of ultimate technology that a first century man like the Apostle John was trying to describe. I believe what we have here are advanced mobile vehicles that can fire nuclear weapons. Now, the Bible rarely emphasizes that something that is about to happen was prepared for the exact hour, day, month, and year. Yet these four angels were carefully prepared to execute what they are about to do. It says they were released for the purpose of killing a third of mankind. The four evil angels that were bound will use 200 million soldiers that come from east of the Euphrates River, which was the ancient boundary between Asia Minor and Asia. So they come from Asia to fulfill their purpose. In chapter 16, verse 12, they're called the kings, plural, of the east. The prophecy says, "And the sixth angel poured out his bowl upon the great river, the Euphrates, and its water was dried up, that the way might be prepared for the kings of the east." The four angels that were bound at the place on the Euphrates will dry it up so that this vast army from Asia will be able to attack the armies of the king of the north, Russia, as explained in Daniel chapter 11, verses 40 through 45, which actually gives the battle plan of Armageddon. The head of these kings, plural, will undoubtedly be China. Students of prophecy have said this for at least 3 centuries. I have proclaimed this for 55 years. And now, what seemed unlikely then is obvious now. China's a rising superpower that will ultimately contend with the other predicted world powers for control of the world's natural resources. With that prophecy in mind, it's ominous to realize that China is working on a terrifying, lethal carrier killer ballistic missile called the Dongfeng 21. U.S. Navy Admiral Robert Willard said that he believes the ship killer has already reached initial operational capacity and is ready for deployment. Can you imagine several aircraft carriers being wiped out in a matter of minutes? China also recently released photographs of a new fighter aircraft it is developing that looks just like the F-117A stealth fighter. China reverse engineered an F-117 stealth that had been shot down over Serbia in 1999. Professor Huang Jing from Singapore's Lee Kuan Yew School is a former advisor to China's army. He said Beijing is losing its grip on up-and-coming field-grade officers. He said, the young officers are taking control of strategy, and it's like young officers in Japan in the 1930s. This is very dangerous. They're on a collision course with a U.S.-dominated system. The prospect of China militarizing the way that Japan did in the 1930s is a terrifying concept. Towards the end of the first century, when the Apostle John was given the vision of the last days in the book of Revelation, the total human population of the earth was approximately 180 million people. But in John's vision, the kings of the east fielded an army of 200 million men. That means the army in his vision was larger than the entire world population even of that time. The number of the armies of the horsemen was 200 million. I heard the number of them. Meanwhile, as these predicted alliances grow in strength and purpose, all are preparing for exactly the same eventuality. And every single one of them has some vested interest in events ongoing in Israel, drawing them irresistibly into the cauldron of Middle Eastern politics. The final sphere of global power is called in Daniel 11:40, the King of the South. The King of the North and the King of the South will make their war with the Antichrist, who is described in Daniel chapter 11, verses 36 through 39. The heart of the southern sphere of power is Mecca. Muslim nations dominate what has been called the 1040 window on the globe, which runs from Mauritania on the Atlantic coast across the north of Africa, down the Arabian Peninsula, and to the islands of Indonesia in the Pacific. The Muslim nations have become a power to be reckoned with because of their suicidal devotion to Islam and their willingness to die as a martyr in spreading it. Bible prophecy says that the King of the South will join forces with the King of the North, who equips them with weapons for war and leads them. Just this week, Iran's foreign minister predicted that the nation will soon restore full diplomatic relations with Egypt, a relationship that has not existed for the last 3 decades under deposed President Hosni Mubarak. In today's world, there exists a revived form of the Roman Empire, a strengthening alliance between Russia and Iran, a potential military colossus in China, and the Muslim nations linking together to form the 4th sphere of world power. Interestingly, the one unifying force that is causing the Muslim nations to set aside their sectarian hatreds and join together is their mutual loathing of the Jews and their nation in the Holy Land. All is rapidly falling into place for the ultimate conflict over who will possess Jerusalem. And that is the quarrel which will drag all the world powers into Armageddon. As of today, there's a 5th sphere of global power, but it seems to play no discernible role in the events that occur in the 7-year tribulation just before Christ returns to the earth. The United States has been Israel's protector and champion since her rebirth, but since the signing of the Oslo Accords in 1993, it has been shifting support away from Israel and toward the concept of land for peace. That's the notorious peace equation designed in Europe, which echoes Daniel's prophecy that the government of the Antichrist shall divide the land for gain. Since Washington signed on to the Oslo Land for Peace formula, including the provisions that would divide Jerusalem, the United States has been subjected to escalating terror attacks, natural disasters, an abysmal loss of political prestige abroad, and so on. Zechariah prophesied that it will come about in that day that I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone for all the peoples. More precisely, from the original Hebrew, all who attempt to deal with it will be severely injured, and all the nations of the earth will be gathered against it. Admittedly, how the U.S. is removed from its preeminent political position in the last days is speculation. Terror attack, financial collapse, the rapture, whatever the reason, the Bible predicts just 4 spheres of global power during the tribulation, not 5. In this generation, we're eyewitnesses to the fulfillment of detailed and specific prophecies, thousands of years old, that could only be fulfilled once in history. The Arab-Israeli conflict was born out of the restoration of Israel in 1948. The Benelux Treaty that formed the genesis of the revived Roman Empire was signed in 1948. The Cold War that gave birth to the Soviet client state system that encompasses the Gog-Magog alliance began with the Berlin airlift in 1948. The Communist People's Republic of China roared into existence in 1948, driving Chiang Kai-shek and nationalist China across the Straits of Formosa to Taiwan. We're now reaching the latter years of the generation that saw the birth of these alignments predicted by the ancient prophets. And God also promised that the generation that saw the rebirth of Israel would not pass away until it saw Jesus return in the clouds for his bride. That means it's time to get ready.
To support this program, send your tax-deductible gift to Hal Lindsey Media Ministries, P.O. Box 470-470, Tulsa, Oklahoma 74147. You can also support this ministry online. Visit hallindsey.com or call 1-888-RAPTURE.
I have a question. Why is no one in the mainstream media talking about the latest deal between Saudi Arabia and China? In case you haven't heard, the Saudis recently offered to guarantee China unlimited oil until 2035 in exchange for Chinese off-the-shelf nuclear missiles. The Saudis have conducted secret top-level negotiations since January for the acquisition of single nuclear warhead medium-range ballistic missiles known as the Dongfeng 21. Here's what Debkafile.com is reporting. The Saudis have offered the fabulous sum of $60 billion in payment for the purchase of the missiles. Part of the package would be the construction of new bases to house them in the Saudi desert regions most inaccessible for Iranian attack. You see, the raw fact, which the West does not want to acknowledge, is that Saudis fear Iran and want nuclear weapons as a counterbalance to Iran's growing nuclear potential. And there is nothing the West can do to stop it. The Saudis have the oil, the Chinese want the oil. We don't really have much to bring to the bargaining table. Debkafile goes on to report, the Saudis also put on the table as part of the price a long-term commitment to cover all China's oil needs until the year 2035, no matter what happens in the interim, and irrespective even of an oil crisis besetting the desert kingdom. Never before has any oil-producing country offered such terms, least of all the world's largest oil exporter. In effect, Gulf sources point out Riyadh agreed to open its oil fields to partial Chinese control for the sake of gaining nuclear missiles. But this is what Israel has been warning the West about for years now. The Israelis have said that if we stand by and allow Iran to acquire nuclear weapons, it will not only pose a direct threat to Israel, but it will force other nations in the Middle East to acquire nuclear weapons for their own self-defense. It will ignite an arms race in a rough neighborhood. I think it's interesting that even though most of the Arab nations in the Middle East have long suspected that Israel possessed nuclear weapons, none of them felt threatened enough to seek their own arsenals. But now that it's almost guaranteed that one of their own Muslim brothers is going nuclear, some of them suddenly feel the need for a nuclear deterrent. Now that ought to say something to you. But you know, folks, this story is bigger than just a massive new Middle Eastern arms race. This begins to answer some questions I've had about why China would be drawn into the war of Armageddon. Let me go through just a few scriptures that I've done before in Revelation chapter 16, verse 12 first, where it says, the way of the kings of the east is prepared to come into the war of Armageddon. It talks about them being prepared to enter a war. Revelation chapter 9 describes the preparation for that war that is given, that is predicted in Revelation chapter 16, verse 12. Now listen, here we are, Revelation chapter 9, beginning with the 14th verse. And there was one angel saying to the sixth angel who had the trumpet, "Release the four angels who are bound at the great river Euphrates." And the four angels who had been prepared. Now listen to this. The Bible seldom makes such explicit mention of exact time. It says these four angels had been prepared for the hour, the day, the month, and the year, and were released so that they might kill a third of mankind. You know, it's something that is very clearly taught in the Bible that demons are very territorial. And apparently these were four archons, the mightiest of all of the fallen angels that we call demons. The Bible calls them demons. The four mightiest that apparently stood guard over the Middle East and the entrance into Asia. They were bound so that they couldn't cause a great conflict between the East and the West that would annihilate the human race. So they were bound and kept until the hour, the day, the month, and the year that God's restraint of them is going to be taken away. And what do they immediately do? They cause a launch of death that will kill a third of the population of the earth. Now listen further. It says, and the number of the armies of the horsemen was 200 million, and I heard the number of them. Now, once again, here's something unusual in the scripture. He makes sure that you understand. He heard correctly. There's going to be an army cross the great river Euphrates from the Orient of 200 million. And they're called riders. And then, this is something that's always confounded students of prophecy, because it goes on to say that they are riders of horses. It says, and this is how I saw in the vision the horses and those who sat on them. The riders had breastplates, the color of fire and of hyacinths and of brimstone, and the heads of the horses are like the heads of lions, and out of their mouth proceeds fire and smoke and brimstone. Now, there's something you have to understand here. John was a first century writer under the inspiration of God, but he had to write out of his own experience of what he had seen. Now, he is seeing weapons that no man had ever heard of or seen or dreamed of back in the first century. And he describes them as horses. Now, that isn't a strange phenomenon, because that was the most mobile thing he knew. It's like, for instance, the American Indians. When they first saw a locomotive come across the plains, what did they call it? An iron horse. But you see described here is something not a horse. They just dub it that because it was the greatest thing of mobility that they knew at that time. It says it has a head that spurts fire and a tail that puts out death. So it is a mobile appliance of today, I believe, a tank. And that's the best way they knew how to describe it. It's a mechanized army of 200 million soldiers streaming for the first time in a massive invasion of history from the Asian part of the world into the Middle East. Now, you know, I've often wondered, why would the kings of the East, with a 200 million man army, cross the Euphrates and come into that area? Well, Daniel chapter 11, verses 40 through 45, describes the battle plan of the first battle of Armageddon. It's when the king of the north and a group of Arabic people pull together and launch an attack on the Middle East, on Israel and the king of the south. Now, the king of the south is based on Saudi Arabia. And in Ezekiel chapter 38, the battle that's described there, it describes how the king of the north, which is the power to the extreme north of Israel, which could only be Russia, and it leads an army that also is joined by a confederacy headed by Iran, call it Persia there in Ezekiel 38, and these together will launch an attack against Israel and go against the king of the south. And that is described by the ancestors that make up the Saudi Arabian people. Now, they come into this battle. Why do they come in? Well, you know, I've always said there'd have to be a logical reason for them to launch an attack on this force that comes led by Russia and Iran into the Middle East. Well, until the year 2035, Saudi Arabia is guaranteeing China all the oil they can use, no matter what happens. And they will even have Chinese troops to help guard the missile sites that they're going to get from China. So this means that now China, and probably his allies, because it says kings plural of the East, sees their oil threatened, and so that is the motive for bringing this massive 200 million man army from Asia in to attack this force led by Gog of Magog, the Russian-led Iranian confederacy of Muslim nations with them, that launch an attack and threaten their oil supply. Folks, I believe that this may be answering a question I've had for all these years. It's logical, and now it's on paper, that there's a treaty being formed that gives every reason why the kings of the East will invade the Middle East after they invade Israel and threaten the oil sources that were guaranteed to them. It's getting close, folks. I believe it's guaranteed to year 2035. I believe Jesus is coming for the church before that, because I think this is going to happen long before 2035. Think about that for a moment. Now, why am I reporting such a frightening warning at this time? As one of God's watchmen on the walls, I am charged with sounding the prophetic alarm. For over 50 years, I have been warning that shortly before the church is caught up to meet Christ in the air in an event known as the rapture, America must fall as a major power. In all of Bible prophecy about the last days, there are no major powers predicted other than the four spheres of global power that have been carefully noted by Bible prophets. They're described geographically from God's world center point, Israel. The West will be ruled by a revived form of the Roman Empire, not the United States. Daniel predicts that the Antichrist will rise out of the people that destroyed Jerusalem in AD 70. Now, where is this? Just listen carefully. And the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. Notice that Daniel predicts that the people of a future prince will destroy Jerusalem and the temple. Now, the Roman 10th Legion, commanded by Titus of Rome, fulfilled this, and the temple has been in ruins until this day. This coming prince must rise out of the same people that destroyed Jerusalem in AD 70. He is the one that will raise up the people and the culture of the old Roman Empire and make a covenant, a false covenant, howbeit, that guarantees Israel's security. This revived Roman Empire will be the ultimate world power. At the same time, there will arise the king of the north,
This is Russia and its Muslim allies, headed by Persia, or modern Iran. The kings of the East, headed by China, as predicted in Revelation chapter 16, verse 12, and chapter 9, verses 14 through 18. And the kings of the South, which are the Muslim nations not in the Iranian alliance. The main point is that there is no place in end-time prophecy for a major world power like the United States of America. So, if this is the time that I believe it is on God's prophetic time clock, America must soon decline and its power be passed on to the Roman culture and people led out of Rome, the city. Now that is revealed in Revelation chapter 17, verse 18, where the prophet John writes that the revival of the Roman Empire, called the Great Whore of Babylon, is none other than the city of Rome. Listen again carefully. And the woman whom you saw is the great city which literally is reigning over the kings of the earth. John carefully notes that the head of the revived Roman Empire will be the great city which is reigning. Present tense in the original Greek, which means is reigning at his time and will continue reigning until it is judged by Christ at the second coming. Folks, all the predicted players are in place and ready for their final act. Our Lord's coming for the church is at hand. It could happen at any moment. So don't be afraid if our familiar world is suddenly and catastrophically changed. It only means that Christ coming in the air to snatch us up to meet him is extremely near. Put your full trust in Jesus Christ and fear not. All who have received his pardon for sin and received him as their Lord do not have any reason to be afraid. No matter who is our president, our destiny is in the hands of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Make sure that you have confessed your sin and received him as your Savior. That is the one great decision that each of us must make. Well, that's it for tonight, folks. Next week, I hope I'll be here with you again. God willing, I will. Good night.
You've been watching the Hal Lindsey Report. To support this program, send your tax-deductible gift to Hal Lindsey Media Ministries, P.O. Box 470-470, Tulsa, Oklahoma 74147. You can also support this ministry online. Visit hallindsey.com or call 1-888-RAPTURE.